everybody, and welcome to the Backline. My name is Adam Cawley, alumnus of the Second City Main Stage.
And my name is Rob Norman. I'm author of the cool improv book, Improvising Now, A Practical Guide to Modern Improv.
Rob, what is the latest? I see you've got a bandana around your neck. That signals that you are up to something.
Yeah, it's cowboy time. I don't know if you know this, but it's Tuesday afternoon. It's cowboy time. Been having a very busy summer here in Toronto, as you know. Once the snow melts, boy, do things get crazy. We're talking improv shows. We're talking big-time bike rides. We're talking bandanas around the neck.
Yeah, Toronto is they crave a warm day, and so what are we in May? So if you could see it in March. Like if there's a warm day near the end of March, patios open immediately, and people will bundle up and just be on a patio, even though it is not weather for a patio. People are just so pumped to please enjoy the city because those winter times can be pretty rough.
Well, we live in a very cold city, and we visited many cold places. And if you go to Chicago, if you go to Copenhagen, they don't have the same obsession with patios as we do for some reason. For some reason, in Toronto, we've decided that patios are the coolest place to be, and that sitting in a parking lot, which most often they are, like there's a bar right by my house where literally took the parking lot and put a metal fence around it and then put tables and chairs in there, and people line up to go sit in the parking lot and drink alcohol. For some reason, we've decided that's the most fun thing that you can do in this city.
It does feel like the citizens, just the generational weather trauma has made everybody feel like this is my protest. I know it's cold. I don't care. I'm going to be outside. Doesn't matter. I'm going to line up for this thing because I want it. And I know that it's going to take an hour, but it doesn't matter. I want it. And it's like they're angry at this invisible weather person.
And then you go to LA and you go, now we're going to see some serious patios here. No patios. No patio culture.
No, but it's like there's just open air things. LA is so still. Like if you put a plant outside your house, it will be there in 3 years. Where in Toronto, there's just like so much chaos in the weather that nothing looks the same. Constant rain, wind, snow, whatever it is. But there's just things here where it's like, oh, that gum? I've seen that gum on the sidewalk for the last 10 years. It'll just be there forever because nothing changes.
Oh, right. That's true, isn't it?
And so when it rains here, like even a little, it might rain like 14 days a year. But when it rains, all of the gas and oil and dirt that's just been sitting stagnant, like becomes this sludge. And that's why it's so dangerous to drive in the rain here. Because everything just liquefies that's been there for like a year, and that it becomes this slick. It's very bizarre.
Whoa, weird.
This is fascinating, I'm sure, to everybody who is listening, who came here for an improv podcast. But we started talking about this for a very specific reason. We were talking about...
we did?
Yeah. I brought this up because... There's a lot of differences between Canadian weather and American weather, European weather, and how all the citizens of those countries, or permanent residents, how they all deal with it. And we got a question in the old Backline mailbag. We haven't dipped into the mailbag too often because we've been so pumped about our own topics. But please, feel free to keep writing into the Backline mailbag, and we will get to you. But one of the questions that we got actually more than once was talking about improv itself, the whole idea of where this thing came from. And I think as improv is expanding across the world, especially now where people are getting trained from all over the world. You can take a workshop in any country in the world. I was teaching people, and it was like 4 a.m. where they were. The idea that, oh, I don't live in that city, so I can't train at that training center is over. So people are starting to take claims of, oh, well, we started this kind of improv, or this is what we do in our city. And so wanted to go back to kind of the roots of what is improv? Is improv an American art form? Is improv have roots elsewhere? And I wanted to go because I know that you have done a big deep dive into improv's history over the last couple of years. And so for myself, for listeners, let's break it down. Is improv an American art form, or does this go deeper than that?
Well, I think we have to start with this big question. Are we going to call Commedia dell'arte improv? Do you remember Commedia dell'arte, AC?
Oh, I do. It was like...
you did some. Did you do some?
It's like the idea of... Well, I did a bunch in like high school drama, a little bit in college. And it's like when someone shows you, like your parents, if they ever showed you like an old Alfred Hitchcock movie, and you're like, The Birds, this was the scariest thing in the world. And you're like, oh, okay. And you watch it, you're like, oh, I can see the strings that the birds are being held on. This is not scary at all. And I think Commedia dell'arte is the same thing of like getting people now excited about Commedia dell'arte and being like, no, it's real great. And then you experience it and you're like, oh, comedy's changed.
So Commedia dell'arte is masked characters. These characters are like kind of archetypes that you would, there's like, I don't know, like maybe 10, 15 different characters, and they kind of work in a similar way. They take up a same kind of psychic space within a show, and you might not have a script playing these characters, but the characters kind of all work the same way from production to production. Just for the sake of argument, I'm going to say that that's a separate thing. I don't know. AC, I don't know if you disagree, if you agree, I don't know, but it feels like it kind of spans this world between clown and improv. But for the most part, we know that modern improv started with this woman named Viola Spolin out of Chicago. It was part of this project that was funded by the American government. Neva Boyd, who was Viola Spolin's boss, was paid by the American government to teach immigrant children how to socialize. And they were going to use play and sport to socialize. An offshoot of that was Viola Spolin's work, which was using theater, play, to try and socialize immigrant children into American society. So improv could not be more American. It was an offshoot of the American military industrial complex.
Wait, what?
It was funded by, well, I mean, what they were training people to do is to train or indoctrinate immigrant children so that if a war, which was around the corner, would happen, they would have soldiers, people who would interact better with our society.
Whoa. That's,
Whoa.
It's kind of gross when you think of like... and these people ended up doing birthday parties for 12-year-olds. Great.
Huh. Weird, huh? What's that cartoon? Do you ever watch Teddy Ruxpin, where they had the scientist who couldn't invent anything he wanted to, but he still made useful things? So he tried to make a submarine, but it ended up being an airship.
Yeah.
So Neva Boyd's work was to try and indoctrinate immigrant children into the army, and it ended up being a fun thing for kids to do at birthday parties. So yes, very much so. The origins of improv is American. It is definitely a Western tradition. Thinking also about modern improv, which I would say like is the Compass in the Second City, which happened in Chicago. This was not only an American art form, this was very much a particular class of people. Hyper educated, upper class, white folks getting together in a kind of seedy, retrofitted laundry and doing jokes about Freud and Sartre and all of the cool figures from literature that everybody had these shared references. It definitely was a particular kind of person that was interested in improv. And probably till quite recently, it's the same groupings of people who have been historically interested in improv.
Just the references have changed from Sartre to, my God, like every sitcom, every Simpsons joke, every Seinfeld joke, just repurposed from someone saying it on stage, hoping no one notices. So Viola Spolin, gets this funding, starts, bringing together the neighborhood, the local children, starts doing these improv games. So then where does the actual improv begin? Because we know they're kind of training. There's these exercises, but then where do we go from there?
So we know that the major force is the Compass players, which is like Elaine May, Paul Sills, which is Viola Spolin's son. Mike Nichols is a part of that crew. Severn Darden. Dell is a part of that crew, Del Close. For the most part, the Compass is the meeting place where everyone is kind of honing their skills. And from that, we create these offshoots. So there's this group called the St. Louis Compass, which takes a big group of people. Some people go and create the Second City. And then much later, we go and create, on the West Coast, the Committee. And those three major improv troupes kind of lay the groundwork in America. And to this day, if you were to name an improv troupe, you could probably trace their lineage through one of these three companies. Like, for example, the Groundlings was started by one of the stage managers of the Committee. So there's this kind of organic growth that happened along the West Coast independent of everyone else. You talk about something like Upright Citizens Brigade. Well, that was a troupe at the I.O. Chicago that moved to New York and then ended up meeting on the West Coast. And stylistically, the way they think about improv, they're very different because they had a different development, and the ideas they were exposed to were quite different. If you are somewhere, for example, in Idaho somewhere, you might be getting ideas from a whole bunch of different places, and you're trying to figure out, what is our voice? What do we do here? And those decisions will influence your entire community of what kind of improv you do and what style of improv you do.
And as we said kind of off the top, like, now feels like the biggest increase in sharing ideas, improv-wise, right? Like, you think about those three, you got Second City, you got the Committee, you got the St. Louis Compass. It's like, how do you share ideas between those three? It's going to take days on a train to get from one place to the next. You got a little notebook, you do a workshop, you have a show, then you move on. That's it. And so you think about now, it's so amazing that with books, videos, Zoom, you can share all of these ideas, even festivals, right? How many times did you and I go to a festival, meet a teacher we've never heard of, get some instruction and say, oh my God, I'm going to take this back to Toronto. I'm going to take this when we go on tour. It's an amazing way to share ideas, but where did we, like, what was the first big branch out explosion? How did it go from one to the other?
What do you mean by the branch out? Like, how did it, like, go from
so
one
we've got
company
these three,
to the next company?
Yeah, we've got these three. And then what happens? How do we get these satellite stages? How does this start to spread?
Yeah, I mean, I think for the most part, Chicago seems to be the headquarters of improv. When it develops this kind of legacy through Saturday Night Live, people start to flock there. And so we end up with most of the major thinkers, the big players in America, all coming out of Chicago. We have Second City, we have The Annoyance, and we have the I.O. And, from I.O. from the I.O. we get two things. We get The Annoyance, which is Mick Napier and Susan Messing and Joe Bill, all those incredible folks who have a different approach to long-form improvisation and sketch. And then we also get the Upright Citizens Brigade, which is a troupe of folks. Amy Poehler, Matt Besser, Adam McKay was a part of this group for a while, who try and take what they learned in Chicago and go to New York. And they start their own style of long form. And this style of long form is very interesting because, Upright Citizens Brigade, and you could probably talk about this better than I could, really mechanized Game of the Scene. We'd always talked about Game of the Scene in Truth and Comedy. I think it was always a part of the I.O. But if you were to look at an I.O. Herald team and a UCB Herald team, you could probably see the differences, especially as time progresses. IO shows, for me, always felt a lot more, they felt grounded, they felt exploratory, where UCB really kind of honed what they decided was good improv, which was great premises, attacking scenes, and having a kind of system that eliminated failures or hesitation within the show. So from a place like UCB, we end up getting things like Free Association out of London, England, not Ontario, who have taken that idea, for me, even further. So definitely there is this idea of as these troops are allowed to develop and form, we get these particular styles that almost become more specialized and more specific in what they want to do. And if you return, for example, a Free Association show and put it next to, let's say, an old school IO show, or maybe something else on the West Coast, like, for example, something from Unexpected Productions out of Seattle, I think you would see something drastically different from each other, even though they might be doing the same Herald. It looks and feels completely different.
Yeah, this is where I get really excited about seeing these small changes, right? It's like ordering the same meal at many different restaurants and being like, oh, what a weird spice you've added. So after the break, I want to come back and talk about the differences between American improv, other countries, and their improv styles. So we've been talking about the origins of improv, where it actually started, and we did a whole podcast on that, about the history of improv. But today I want to talk a bit more about the differences that now exist from country to country, even city to city, theater to theater. So just on a very basic level, you've done a lot of touring in Europe and the like. How would you describe American improv? Specifically American improv.
It's very interesting because I would say that Canadian culture and American culture are quite similar. One of the major differences would be like directness. I feel like our culture is quite indirect with how we express ourselves and how we express our emotions, and that's often confused as niceness, if that makes sense. Like I was teaching a writing class out of Chicago, but virtually, and at the end of the class, everyone's like, "Wow, you're so nice." I'm like, nah, I'm not. I'm definitely not nice. But I think it just registers that way. Likewise, when I'm working with my incredible American colleagues and feedback is given, sometimes I'm taken a little aback, where I'm like, oh, this feels very personal. And I have to remind myself that expression is just a cultural expression. It's direct, it's to the point, it's no hard feelings. Where for us in Canada, you might take some extra steps to kind of dance around things a little bit more. With an improv, I think that also kind of manifests itself in a certain way. I would say Americans are incredible at political satire, which might be the most direct art form. But I think Canadians end up being much stronger at characters. I'm thinking about Jim Carrey. I'm thinking about Mike Myers. I'm thinking about The Kids in the Hall. I think some of that indirectness manifests itself as a kind of shield. We're going to hide behind someone else to actually say the things that we want to say, because to do so in any other context would be incredibly rude. So we kind of have these strange behaviors developing based on kind of cultural norms as well, too.
Yeah, it's funny, like when you think of talking about comedia and masks, it feels very much like that's character is Canadian's mask, where we can, I can say this thing as long as I have this wig on, as long as I am this other person. You can't get mad at me. It's not me saying it. It's this person saying it. And especially, I remember early Second City days hearing from directors how uncomfortable cast members would be being themselves. Being in front of an audience and just being who you were, playing close to yourself, was uncomfortable. You needed something to fuel inspiration that you couldn't be blamed for or you couldn't be criticized. The character, I don't like that character. That's fine. That's not me. I tell the story all the time about Bob Martin, who is a Second City Toronto alumni who went on to write tons of very Tony Award-winning musicals. He starred on Broadway, and one of the shows was The Drowsy Chaperone. And he was the star. And he had performed in Toronto a bunch, but never on the scale of Broadway, especially the star. And the producers had to teach him how to bow, because Bob Martin's version of bowing was walking out very sheepishly, kind of shoulders shrugging, small wave, a little grin of like, thanks. Oh, I can't believe you liked me. Okay. And the producers had to say, you idiot, these people paid like hundreds of dollars to see you. They need you to show them that they didn't waste their money. They need you to show them that, yes, what you've just experienced is incredible. So come out there, arms up in the air. You are the star. And it's like, what a shift in mindset. Simply because, like, Bob's an incredible performer, very talented. It's just not used to it. Not used to saying to a massive room full of people who paid hundreds of dollars to see you that, yes, I am worth this. Incredible shift of mindset. The talent is no different. It's just, how do we feel about that talent is quite different.
Mm-hmm. Absolutely. Yeah.
So, okay, so we've talked about that idea, but the history and the development of Canadian improv was very different. Like, it felt, in America, you could see the lineage, you could see the connection, the growth from one to the other. But in Canada, it felt like things were popping off randomly. So how did the development of the Canadian system work?
So the Canadian improv was developed in 3 different ways, 3 different parts, which would be Keith Johnstone out of Calgary, the University of Alberta, I think. And he was doing some kind of improvised type work out of London, England, when he came to do his residency here. And he kind of stumbled upon improv independent of everyone. He would take drama students and would put them up on stage. And when he got bored of them, he'd go, get off stage. Next group, go up. I'm bored of you. Next group, go on. And from that, he would kind of figure out these rules. And those rules became very, very codified. The other part of this would be our good friend David Shepard. So David Shepard, strangely enough, was a member of the Compass. He left the Compass because he was frustrated. What he wanted to do was create social change. And he wanted to use unscripted storytelling to do that. So he would go to places like a mine and try and do a show on the workers' lunch break. Obviously, that didn't do very well. People,
but we've all been
really
there.
Like learning a lesson.
We've all done shows that were like, this sounded like a good idea, but this beer festival in the middle of Toronto at 9 p.m., no one wants to see improv games right now.
1,000,000%. I've just survived World War II. I don't have an education. I have to go work in a literal mine. I'm breathing in coal or whatever you're mining. I come out. I open my lunchbox. Oh, I'm going to have a sandwich. I'm so hungry.
You, sir.
Everyone gather around. Let's talk about... yeah. We're going to play Should Have Said. Should have gone to war. So after he leaves the Compass, he decides that he wants to... use improv for school kids, young folks. And he starts up this kind of show, which he calls the Improv Olympic in New York City. It has a tough time there. Someone sees that show or hears about that show, and they invite him up to Toronto to start a league. And that becomes the Canadian Improv Games for us. So David Shepard was a huge part of improv. And from the Canadian Improv Games, it spreads all throughout our country. So that you have kids at the age of 14 and 15 training in improvisation at a very, very young age, creating a very high level of familiarity with improv and how it works. And then finally, we have the Improv League Nationale, which would be out of Quebec. Again, this is completely independent of anyone else. A guy and his friend, they are actors. They're sitting in a bar. They're looking at the television. They're watching the Montreal Canadiens and go, I wish there was a way that we can combine theater, which I love, with hockey, which I love. And within 2 weeks after having that discussion, they had a television show on Quebec television, which is just an insane story. It's a great, and they didn't have any training. They didn't know what they were doing. They had an idea, and then it became a TV show. And so that's like the Canadian part of our improv. Also within the 1970s, I should mention these things are all happening in the 1970s. Also happening within the 1970s in Toronto, there's a very talented Godspell cast who is like Catherine O'Hara, Eugene Levy, all the greats. They are kind of sucked up for this touring company of this other theater troupe, which is called the Second City. And so this businessman, Andrew Alexander, decides that he's going to make his own Second City, and they put on a little show. It does very, very well, and they get a permanent residency. But that Second City, although inspired by the Chicago Second City, is so far away from the mothership, so far away from what's happening in Chicago. It really develops a voice on its own. And that voice, if you've ever, if you're a Canadian who is a Second City alumni, going down to Chicago to kind of talk with your colleagues about how comedy and improv works, you do feel like a foreigner. It does feel very different because your values, your terminology, they're all different. They're completely different. And sometimes it can feel almost like you're speaking another language where you use a term and everyone goes, what are you talking about? And it's a very simple term. And you go, oh, I have to like rejig the whole way that I'm thinking. So that's the kind of basis of Canadian improv.
Yeah, it's very funny because Canada and America, they're just such huge countries, like geographically. And so when you see the clear evolution of the American system and how you can see one company lead to the next, and I think the modern version, as you mentioned, is that clear IO-UCB connection, right? Like it's so obvious. Even when I went through UCB, the classes are so expensive, but they're so expensive everywhere. But it was like, oh, you could skip level 1 if you have gone through IO. And so a lot of other training centers say, oh, you can start at this level if you have a year or more of training somewhere. But UCB is like, no, only IO, because that's the only thing that is similar to us. And so when you go to Chicago, you usually have people who have trained at some of these theaters. Very rarely do you get someone who gets on Chicago main stage who has not done at least either Second City, IO, or The Annoyance. In Canada, we as you said, we've got these three things beginning almost independently, like no connection, no evolution. And so we still, I feel, have that where if you are a West Coast improviser, if you are a Toronto improviser, a Quebec improviser, you're coming at this thing extremely differently. I came up through the CIG, the Canadian Improv Games, the what David Shepard helped create, and we were trained by people who were trained by CIG people. And because we were so young, it's like we weren't allowed in classes. We weren't allowed in adult theaters. And so we were lucky enough to tour and meet other high school improvisers. And from there, we shared ideas. From watching other teams, we shared ideas. But there was no one saying, this is the way to do it, follow me, and creating a long line of improvisers who have similar terminology, similar goals. It was just like, hey, here's a bunch of options, do whatever. The goal is, do we like you on stage? But it was very rarely like, this is a team, and on this team, you have a coach. And on this team, here are the rules that you have to do. And the coach is following the rules of the artistic director of this theater. And this goes for the entire city. That never happened. And so when you have a main stage in Chicago, I'd say 90% of them speak the same language. When you have a main stage in Toronto, you could have people from all over the country who have no idea what the other person is saying improv-wise on stage. And so it just creates very different performers, because you could do a move on stage, Rob, and a person from another province is like, I've never seen that, and I don't know what you're doing. And I don't know why you're not accepting my offer of this move. And you're like, I've never seen that before. And so it does feel like a bit more individual expectations for Canadian improvisers, because a lot of the times you feel like, I'm on my own here, depending on where you're performing.
Yeah, it also is interesting because, you know, there is this kind of stereotype about American culture and Canadian culture where America is supposed to be this big melting pot, which is you put everything in and you try and pull out the singular best product, and that is America, whatever that is. Canada is a kind of mosaic in which things don't necessarily mix, and we don't seem to mind it not mixing. Like the idea that you're like an Irish Canadian seems to be okay here. It's actually probably cool that you're Irish. You don't need to drop that identity to also be Canadian. So it doesn't feel like anyone ever said, oh, we have these three very different companies. They should all fight each other, and the one that's the best should win. Or you show up to a theater and go, I do this style of improv. And we go, well, you don't know what you're doing. Learn the right style. There's an incredible amount of tolerance for people to be like, I don't know what you're talking about. I don't know what you do. I trust that you've learned. I trust that you're good at this. I don't understand it. So keep doing whatever you do. Hopefully we'll figure it out together.
Now, Rob, going a little off here, can you talk a bit about how theater sports came into play for Toronto?
I mean, I might not be a massive expert into when exactly it came, but I do know that the theater sports was massive here in Toronto in the 1980s. And for the most part, it created a very important foundation in our city about introducing Johnstonian philosophy, but it also was an easy way for a lot of very good sketch performers to try and get a more solid footing. So let me give you an example of that. In the 1980s, there was a little group, which we like to call the Kids in the Hall. And they were a massive part of theater sports here. And if you... Toronto has always been very good at sketch comedy. And so theater sports was a great way for folks who may not even been that interested in improv itself, but very interested in comedy, to find each other, to meet each other. And so although the Kids in the Hall didn't end up going to Second City, they never became alumni of that stage, that's how they found their troupe. Am I missing any details about theater sports in the 1980s, AC? Maybe you have a detail that I'm missing.
No, just the idea that, like, again, it's all of these independent things popping up and people saying, yeah, I'll play that one too, right? You hear a lot of these stories of the allegiances to theaters, and you might be in a city that has 3 improv theaters, and you say, oh no, I'm this performer. I perform at Theater X. And that's what I do. I don't fraternize with the other groups. And in Toronto, it was like, we don't really have that. We've got a bunch of different theaters and styles. And I just moved here from this city. And I just moved here from this city. Okay. Mm-hmm. Yeah, everyone can play together. And so it feels like you're much more likely to be surprised by moves in a Canadian improv show. But I would say the American improv show would be much more cohesive and team-based with similar goals, because a lot of them came up in the exact same training. And it's just, again, neither one's good or bad. It's just really interesting to see, why does a performer perform the way they do? And then as we start to spread to Europe, Australia, South America, all of these places, Africa, you're like, people needed to choose. what are we doing? What are we basing our improv on? And you can see, like, some people in a theater in Eastern Europe, it might say, this is our impro show. And you're like, you're Johnstonian. And you might see another one being like, oh, come see this. A lot of people started saying, like, come see this IO-inspired long form, because people wanted to put their stamp on, this is what we do. And there was much less creation from nothing, because there was already so many examples in North America. But then people just started to say, well, we'll just take this and pull a little UCB of our own and say, we're going to take what you've got and we are going to make our version of something that already exists. And then that leads to another unique offshoot of these theaters.
Yeah, I don't know how much you know about Japan, but they had an emperor who was like, hey, for 200 years, we've decided that we've had enough of the rest of the world. We're isolating everything. We're shutting down our borders. No foreigners are allowed in Japan. And so they're hanging out with this kind of bubble country that no one's interacting with them. They were doing fairly well economically, militarily, but 200 years where you don't associate with anyone else causes all sorts of these problems. Well, all of a sudden an American steamship shows up at their harbor and they're like, what? We got these swords. You guys have guns. You have steam engines. And Japan freaks out and they go like, we're in a lot of trouble. We are not competitive. There's a steamship just showing up. We can't get rid of them. What do we do? And so Japan sent these ambassadors out to all parts of the world. And they found each country that did the best thing. So they decided for some reason that England had the best education system. So they went and they studied that. Some country had the best navy. Another country had the best land army. I think it was Germany. And so they put these kind of Japanese ambassadors to all these places. They came back to Japan and they rejigged their entire country. And so if you see Japanese school folk right now, like the Sailor Moon outfits, that's a Victorian English school uniform. I feel like sometimes when I look at the improv community in Europe, it's that same kind of attitude where it's like, who does the best thing? Oh, you do the best long form? We're now IO, or we're the UCB of Portugal or whatever. And I think that's a great starting spot for us, but we can't pull apart culture from art. And so that sometimes it can feel a little bit like a hair shirt when you're watching a bunch of folks from Portugal improvise in a style that doesn't necessarily reflect Portuguese culture. And over time, those rules that they've learned from elsewhere start to get eroded, and we get closer to what this country's true improv style would be like, what their cultural values actually are. The comedy starts to shape the way that we play, the language that we use, the vocabulary that we use. New ideas from other trainers start to be introduced, and some of those ideas are more popular than the ideas that they're currently doing. And so there really is this kind of evolution that happens very slowly in these places that are non-American cities that are disconnected from American ideology, which I think is exciting.
It is really exciting, and especially over the last few years, a lot of these big companies have kind of collapsed and are rebuilding currently. And what they will become, what IO was and what IO is going to become, we don't know yet, but I assume it's going to be different. And there's just, as you said, this slow evolution. Like, this is a tiny, minuscule example, but the first time I played UCB in New York, I had audience members to the left and right of me. And I was like, what? Well, I'm used to an audience just looking directly at me because that's the way the theaters are in Toronto. I have to change the way I physically stand and present ideas and where I'm allowed to go on a stage. And all of that, just where did the back line, right? The back line in certain theaters, it's like, why would you stand on the back line? Stand on the sides. And it's like, oh, well, you can't stand on the sides in this theater because there's audience there. Just small things like that change the way you enter scenes, change the way that you workshop ideas. And so it's very cool to see what these next stages will be over the next 10, 15 years of these theaters that now maybe have the confidence or the realization that we don't need to mimic another theater. We took some ideas as a base, and now we can grow in any way we see fit, because it doesn't matter.
And it's interesting, like these decisions that are made shape the way we play and the way we see improv. Have you met a lot of folks from the Improv Asylum Boston? Have you met anyone like that?
Yeah, we played there.
Well, this is what I was going to talk about. So before we had toured Boston, before we visited, I had known a couple people just from working at Second City. And I found that folks who came out of Boston were like, I felt very confident in their abilities. They seemed like you could not faze them. They seemed like they had like survived some kind of war, some kind of improv war, and now they were just like ready for anything. And it was like almost a little intimidating playing with these folks because they just had this kind of world wariness that I just didn't understand. And then when we went to go play, we guested on one of the shows, and you walk down the Improv Asylum steps and you go into the stage and you realize that it's like Fight Club. There is an audience all around you. You're surrounded by your audience, and the audience likes to party and they like to drink. And I went, oh, this makes complete sense. Put someone in here for a year, you're never ever going to be scared of a heckler again.
Oh,
like you're going to be great. Like you're fine. And so that has to do with the culture of Boston, but also the way you've designed your theater. Weird, wild.
Yeah, it's incredible. Like again, the CIG. Just to go back for a second, like the CIG is that mixed with Who's Line on TV, mixed with Just for Laughs, which is a Canadian comedy organization, would air things like the French kind of theater sports. They would just air it on TV, and no one's telling me as a kid what's right or wrong. My drama teacher is the one giving me improv exercises that she's probably getting out of a book. Maybe improv.
How dare she?
No, I mean, like, this was a time where there was just very limited access to in-person expertise. And so we all grew up just being like, oh, well, improv is you have 5 events. You've got life, theme, story. Oh my God, I can't remember the rest of them. But like that's what you had to do in the Canadian improv games is every scene was one of these 5 events, and you got judged on those events with a certain score. And that's how you performed. And you didn't know that there were other options out there. And so you just kept building and kept training the next generation. And it's still going on. It's just extremely unique.
I never participated in the CIG. My school was much too disorganized for that. It was a very public school. But I have judged it as an adult, and watching those shows and watching how the events kind of unfold blow my mind every time. So for the most part, like, yeah, you have like theme and I don't know, story, whatever else, character or something like that. They're all pretty standard improv events, except for this one very strange event, which is called the life event, which is decidedly supposed to be unfunny, grounded, talking about a life-altering event.
What we called a pivotal moment. That's what you had to see in the
Adam.
scene.
Right. So it is a bunch of 15-year-olds literally trying to be as funny as they can be without getting yelled at by their teachers, because they want to do jokes, but they're not supposed to. They're supposed to tell stories. So you have this like kind of very disguised attempts at humor where they can't get caught. And then you drop into this life game, and folks are doing David Shepard's dream. where you're supposed to be learning and have a moment of social change where everyone's affected, which is very challenging if you're 14 years old and you haven't experienced life. So you have these very like strange, sometimes Dawson's Creek like energies where someone's talking about like, you know, it's a bunch of very rich kids talking about how serious homelessness is. And you're like, this is not good. This is not a good look. But you can see threads of those experiences in folks who have done CIG now. So when I'm playing with someone, there's something about a player that I could be like, oh, you've done CIG for 5 years. That is your foundation of seeing the world. Also, there's something that's very challenging for CIG performers who have peaked in high school. Like, for example, let's say you're in grade 12 and you're the funniest person at CIG and you win gold.
Go on.
Gold medals. Oh, did you win a gold? No. And you go, well, this is what improv is. And then you join adults doing improv at Second City or within the community. And you go, oh, this is very different than the culture of high school improv. Oh, you guys are talking about pretty graphic stuff. Oh, you guys don't have a life game. Oh, it works very, very different. So there can almost be some kind of unlearning that happens after you go through that experience.
And that's what's so interesting, I think, about where we're at as a global improv community is, for example, when my team, the Toronto Maple Leafs, they'll scout in Europe to get European talent. And it's the same game. It's hockey. However, in Europe, the rinks are bigger. And that one change makes coming from Europe to North America extremely difficult because all of a sudden you have less time. And you're like, oh, when I get the puck, I've got this much space where I can move around, or I've got this much time to make a decision. And then when you remove those two things, it becomes extremely difficult. And so it's so fun where, 20 years ago, you have trained in one area and then you want to go to a new theater or you move cities and you're like, fuck, I don't know how these people play. I don't know what to do. And now it feels like, where are you from? Oh, you guys are UCB based? Okay, I got it. Yeah, no, I read the manual. Yeah, no, I took classes online. Yeah, it's fine. Yeah. Oh, what are you guys doing? Theater sports? Got it. Yeah, I know how to do these. I took workshops with Loose Moose. It's all good. And that was not possible years ago. So it feels like the entire world is kind of able to be on the same page. And what that means for what's next, I don't know. But it seems like it's definitely a clear difference, especially over the last 2 years, that people now have access to information and the ability to make informed decisions on how they want to play.
Well, and I think this is where diversity offers us a path forward, because when you create something, when you are the home base, when you're Chicago, you have a kind of mechanism where you're like, oh, we've been doing this for 50, 70 years, whatever. There's a way to improvise. And eventually that's going to kind of become outdated, or it's going to get old, or it's going to decay, or it's going to break down, or it's not going to be competitive with other art forms that are out there. And by having different people change improv, they're basically these little petri dishes that are creating new insights that can be brought back to America. So, right now we are thinking about the rebirth of the IO coming out of bankruptcy to start again. And maybe we go, oh, well, the Herald's really challenging. It's not bringing in audiences like it used to. Well, actually, there's this theater in Copenhagen that's been doing their variation of the Herald, and it's very popular. Do you want me to teach it to you, IO?
That's really
and that's
fun.
where it gets really exciting. My favorite restaurant, we were talking about Japan earlier, my favorite restaurant is across the street. It's called Gu, and it's a Japanese izakaya. And basically what that is, it's like, in Japan, that would be like an American pub. That's their version of an American pub. But in Toronto, the food isn't like chicken fingers. It's all Japanese version of pub food. And it's my favorite food of all time. So it's like different versions of sushi. There's a bibimbap, which is Korean for some reason in there. but that's the joy. We take something that's great. Someone does an impression of it. They're allowed to kind of solidify it, make it their own thing, and then they return back to the original, and it's completely changed and has new insights into the art form, into the culture. Hopefully, something that we can all use later. So
I love it.
Although to wrap it up, we started this podcast by saying that improv started as perhaps an American art form, but definitely is not anymore.
Well, this is where I want to hear from you out there. I want to hear what can you trace where you are performing in the world back to a certain theater? Where did you all feel like this is the person who started it and they had trained in this theater, who came from this theater? And where are you at, and where do you think you're going? You can always reach out to us at The Backline Pod on Facebook and Twitter, and at The Backline Podcast on Instagram to see cool pictures of me and Rob on tour. Rob, what is inspiring you on stage, off stage right now?
We're talking a lot about Canadiana, and I took a trip down memory lane. There's a new Amazon show called Kids in the Hall, and I've been watching it. Have you been watching it?
That was going to be mine.
Oh, really? No way.
Yeah.
So I don't know if this happened to you, but did you watch the original 90s version of Kids in the Hall?
Yep. I was young, so it was definitely I definitely knew that they were cool. I knew that they were funny, but I don't know if I knew what night of the day they were on or what time of night they were on.
Time of day
Time of
is
day.
the word you're looking for? Well, yeah, because we weren't old enough to understand Kids in the Hall at the time. I would have been just a baby in the 90s, a small little baby.
A 14-year-old baby.
Parents... And my parents were too old to be watching Kids in the Hall. They were not the target demo. And so I kind of skipped Kids in the Hall altogether. I was too young to discover it myself, and my parents were too old to get me into it later. And so when I did return to it in my 20s, I knew I was doing comedy. I'm in Toronto. I should know what Kids in the Hall are. And I sat down to watch some clips on YouTube, or someone had a videotape or something. And I remember watching it, and I just couldn't get a foothold into it, because it was now 20 years old. I didn't understand the references. The production value is different than the production value that I'm used to. It was really challenging, and I knew it was good, but I couldn't understand why it was good. And watching this new series, I go, oh, thank God. Thank God. I've watched 3 or 4 episodes. It is very, very funny. It makes complete sense to me. And I also no longer feel crazy, because I used to teach these writing classes, and students would come in with these scripts, and I'm like, what are you doing? What is this? This is nonsense. And now I'm like, oh, you were trying to do what the Kids in the Hall are able to do so masterfully, but you have not quite mastered it yet.
Yeah,
that's what it was.
I don't think you're alone. I think especially in America, no one watched Kids in the Hall when it started. But then the reruns on Comedy Central, I think, is where people picked it up. I think the same thing happened with Whose Line. And then people are like, oh, this is good? People are really watching these reruns? Let's bring it back. The theme song, I couldn't believe the emotional reaction I had to the theme song. I was instantly taken back to my house growing up, and I could just feel what it was like, because it used to be in front of a live audience at CBC, and so you could hear the crowd reaction. And that was the one thing that's a little odd about the new version, is that there's no crowd reaction, but it's unapologetically Toronto, and it just gives me all the feels inside. I think something that has helped me understand Kids in the Hall a bit more is RuPaul's Drag Race. The idea of taking your silly seriously is very much a Kids in the Hall, and I think a drag queen idea of, we know what we're doing is ridiculous, but we're not winking to the camera. We're giving it our all. Yeah. And if you've ever seen Snatch Game, some of these queens' impersonations and performances are unbelievable. And it feels like Kids in the Hall is very much that of, oh, we will dress up as silly characters. we'll play a chicken, we'll play someone who's crushing your head, we'll play older women, but we're doing it as earnestly as we possibly can. And I think that dichotomy is what sells it, where it's alt in that it's very different and not mainstream, but it also has a sincerity and a commitment that I think is a unique way to handle what the kids are doing.
Yeah, because it doesn't feel like this new series is obsessed with joke per minute ratios. Like there are some sketches that have a lot of twists to them, but that feels more psychedelic to me than it is necessarily performative. Like I feel like sometimes when you see a sketch on paper from a student, you can see there's a lot of these twists that feel quite manipulative. They're quite like, oh, I got you, I'm doing this weird thing, now I'm doing this other weird thing to you. But while I was watching them perform, I thought the exact same thing as you. I'm like, wow, like Dave Foley's really bringing it in this one. Good for, like you're doing it, man. And I'm like, oh, you guys aren't creating these twists for the sake of creating these twists. You're creating these twists because you want to see where it goes and you want to live it. There's a very sad sketch about Kevin McDonald who has written a sketch and he's trapped Dave Foley in the sketch with him. And it's like very self-referential. Dave Foley can't escape this sketch. He's reflecting on the things that he's done or the things that he hasn't done. To me, watching that, I'm like this is like so funny, but it's like 10 out of 10, super interesting, super revealing, very personal.
Yeah, definitely not a scene where you're like, I know where this is going. I get it. Yeah. Let's just watch this play out. You're like, I actually don't know what's happening.
And like not quite the behavior of someone who is a star. Like I think someone tweeted that Barack Obama was watching it, and it was like he was loving it with Michelle. The idea that Kevin McDonald's writing this like self-depreciating sketch, and Barack Obama's like, "Good job!" Like it's very surreal and very strange.
Yeah.
Anyways, I definitely would say go check it out if you love comedy. I feel like it's a nice way for you to gain access to something that you should already be an expert in.
I like that. Well, thank you, Robbie. This podcast, as always, is brought to you by the Sonar Network. If you like the podcast, share it, subscribe, write a comment. We got that bingo bongo improv time. And share it with other improvisers so they have access to it. And Robbie, we will see you next week.
See you next week.